Okay, everyone. Well, we're back here. BioTech IQ visiting Hepion. We've got Robert here. As I mentioned in the intro, we actually had Robert on the podcast, and that was a really good in-depth interview. By the way, I think we were able to pull a video on that, by the way. So that'll be a good one. But since I'm out here, Hepion, I wanted to just quickly grab Robert and maybe get a couple more questions out of you.
Sure.
I appreciate it. So, as I've mentioned a few times throughout this video, NASH has been a challenging disease space, right? There's no approved FDA treatment.
Yeah.
Right. And we just had Jill in who mentioned that, that she believes that, the treatment is going to have to it's not going to be like a single molecule, right? It's going to be a combination of things.
Yeah.
So, while I have you here in person, I wanted to maybe just kind of ask you that question. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the general consensus right now, anyway, is that it will be a combination of products to treat NASH. And so what our rancofolstat has is it has an anti-fibrotic activity that we think is actually quite potent. What other people seem to have predominantly would be molecules that reduce the amount of fat in the liver, but they are not, at least in my view and other people's views, I think it would be accepted that those types of molecules are what we call anti-metabolic molecules. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that if you can reduce liver fat long enough and reduce it enough for a sustained period of time, that you should be able to reduce the fibrosis. So the fibrosis being the downstream event of all of that initial insult to the liver. But they're not truly anti-fibrotic. And so therefore those drugs will take a long time. It could be years and years before the drugs become really, I think, beneficial. And so far, as you mentioned, there are no drugs that are approved by the FDA yet. So I think if they take a drug that's an anti-metabolic to reduce liver fat alongside rancofolstat, or a drug that can reduce fibrosis, then I think you've got that magical combination of an anti-fibrotic, in our case, mm-hmm. with an anti-metabolic or something that can reduce liver fat. So I think that's probably what's going to happen ultimately. Mm-hmm. But our hope, obviously, is that rancofolstat on its own will be able to accomplish what we need it to accomplish clinically.
Right, understandable. So your approach is the anti-fibrosis versus reducing liver fat, right? The anti-metabolic side. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. Well, again, go check out the podcast episode. Robert and I get into a little bit more of an in-depth discussion. Well, actually, Robert gets in depth. I just ask questions and try to understand, which I'm getting better at, right? I've been studying a little bit. So anyway, what I wanted to do here is just kind of capture things more from a work perspective.
Okay.
Right. And, interviewing a couple of your employees here, no scripts, just jumping on camera and I'm asking them questions and, just trying to understand what their work life is like, and what it's like to work here at Hepion. So, first question I wanted to ask you was basically, what excites you about coming to work? Now, let me back up. So you're commuting today. You're typically in Canada.
Yeah.
In Alberta, right?
Yeah.
And then you come down here to headquarters. How often do you do that?
Well, before COVID came along, I was trying to get here once a month. So I spend 1 to 2 weeks every month here. Mm-hmm. So I was more or less splitting my time between the Canadian operation, which is where we have our labs, and then the U.S. operation in New Jersey here, where we have our corporate office, but we have our clinical group here, mm-hmm. and we have accounting and finance here as well.
Okay.
But R&D is really strictly up in Canada, where we have the labs, and so we've got a really nice core group there that does not just the lab work, but also we have artificial intelligence. So our group there is working on modeling and AI and things like that are able to really, I guess the goal is to really understand, first of all, the disease NASH, because I always say, one size doesn't fit all. It's everybody's NASH seems to be slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can't treat everybody the same. And that's where the AI comes in, because using an AI, you can predict beforehand who should respond best to a drug.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have, let's say, certain patient characteristics or traits, and you have maybe a certain profile on your genes or your transcripts, like with your RNA, or even a lipid profile or a metabolic profile, then maybe you're better suited to a certain type of drug. And I think that's really important for us to tease out, because if you look at drug development in the NASH space so far, you see response rates that are not great.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're trying to do is elevate the number of people that can actually respond to these drugs, not just ours, but drugs in general used in NASH. So that's really comes down to the AI and also the modeling. What I mean by modeling is how to look at not just genes and proteins and lipids, for example, but to interpret all of what's happening in what we call the metabolome, or the I'll go broader than that. I'll say the multiome. So if we're looking at the multiome, which encompasses all these different pieces, we want to try to interpret that in light of a moving target. And the moving target in this case is, what are the drug concentrations? So after we take, our drug is orally administered. So after an oral dose, as you can imagine, it takes time for the drug to be absorbed through your gut. And so you see drug concentrations rising, but eventually they'll start dropping. So there's a time course. We call that, pharmacokinetics.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got that moving target of drug concentration, and then you've got all these other things that are happening biologically. So how do you really understand when you give your drug, what will happen, not just with a single dose, but when you multiple dose people for weeks and months and years, and then you try to understand all of those moving pieces. And there's so much data that comes out of this. I mean, literally millions of data points, that the only way to really understand it and get a grasp is using AI. And trust me, if we were to use an Excel spreadsheet, we just wouldn't live long enough to be able to understand what's going on. So.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I know AI is a big topic of discussion right now, and what it can do across the board in our lives. But in terms of like drug development and treatment, being able to accelerate the R&D process, right, and kind of understand. Yeah. And so very interesting. So on your website here, you actually have your own AI platform, AI Power.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing I actually haven't mentioned yet. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that also brings a unique aspect to what you're doing in terms of treatment development, right? You're not just taking that traditional route. So pretty interesting. And I think, so you talked about pharmacokinetics and basically kind of understanding who would be more, I guess, predisposed to benefit from the treatment, right? And figuring that out earlier.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So is that what excites you then about getting up and working?
I think what excites me is, and I've said this before, you sort of get to the age where you think, what am I going to do? When I get to a certain point in my life, do I ever think about retiring, for example? Or do I continue building companies, and what do you do? So you sort of, on a personal level, you try to decide, what is it that kind of gets me out of bed in the morning. And I know some guys get to the point in their lives, in their careers, where they say, I think I'd rather go golfing. I want to golf, I want to retire, I want to do these things, I want to relax. But if I were to choose anything I could possibly do to relax, it's this. And I know it sounds kind of crazy because, well, first of all, I'm a terrible golfer. Don't really like it a lot. And if I want to just pass time and enjoy what I'm doing, like kind of, if I could imagine myself sitting on a beach, somewhere in a tropical location, I want to be thinking about drug development. So I'm enjoying the sun. I'm enjoying the sound of the waves, crashing on the beach type of thing. But I'm thinking about drug development, because that's what that's what I do for fun. And then when I combine drug development and the science with the people, because we have, it's a small group, it's 20 some people, but each one of these people is like almost like cherry picked, and we have a culture that fits. So we all work extremely well together. And I know it sounds really cliche to say this, but we call it the Hepion family, and it is quite cliche. I'm sure a lot of companies will say that, but we really, really mean it. And to give you an idea of how long we've been together as family members, I mean, Hepion is a relatively new corporate entity. But for example, in Edmonton, where I spend a lot of time in the R&D facility, I've worked with these guys for more than 2 decades. So the fellow Pat Mayo, who heads up our analytics and our clinical pharmacology, so pharmacometrics, the modeling, the pharmacokinetics, and all the AI. And I go back knowing Pat at some level, and I'm aging myself here, 1976. Believe it or not, we played in a band together.
Wow.
And so we went to school together. We did all these things together. We came out with pretty much the same type of qualifications through our graduate work. And we've worked together for decades. The new kid on the block in Edmonton is our chief scientific officer, and he joined us in 2003 at my last company. So, it's coming up to 20 years, and he's the new guy. Dan Trepanier, who is another guy who develops our formulation, works on patents, works on chemistry and manufacturing. Like, he does a lot of different things. He's got expertise in a lot of areas. He joined us about, I'd say, 25, 26 years ago. So again, these people, we've all worked together in the last entity that we brought another drug that got approved about a year ago. So we worked on that drug for many, many years, and now that's approved. But that core group that has this expertise and has the right mindset as a culture, I'm biased, but we've all been transplanted over here to Hepion.
Mm-hmm.
And we're bringing that, decades and decades of research and bringing all that corporate culture and almost like corporate memory with us.
Yeah.
So we're not, this is not our first rodeo, so to speak.
Right. Well, and I think that's an interesting aspect of this is that, of course, over time, new people will come on board and get involved as things grow. But I also think it speaks to like that closeness that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Of the family aspect of it, where you've been, for some reason, all of you are still comfortable working with each other after 20 years, right? And that says a lot. I mean, a lot of us, I'm probably midway through my career and all that, and earlier stages, I remember working at a couple of different organizations, and I learned great things in all of them, and I met great people at all of them. But I did have an experience a couple of times in small and large where there was just challenges with that, right? I worked at a small family-owned company where the father was the CEO and the son was the president and all this, and there's a very weird, interesting dynamic that would take place. And I worked at a large organization where the whole they say company politics really played a huge role in the bureaucracy and all of that. So anyway, that speaks a lot. So that's exciting. You mentioned that you played in a band. What instrument do you play?
Oh yeah, years ago I played trumpet. So I actually started my, you call it, career in music, and then I'd been playing for so many years. Like I'd played since I was about 6 years old. And so what happened in my 20s is I wound up damaging my esophagus. And
wow.
Had some major surgery. And so at that time, I just thought, man, this is not going to work out for me. And there's a lot of, it's very competitive in the music industry.
Oh, yeah.
You see these people like huge talent, and they struggle. Mm-hmm. And so then I had the surgery, and I thought, together with being super competitive industry and then having the surgery, I thought, I gotta find something else to do. So
yeah.
So I really honestly didn't even know what I wanted to do in the early stages until I sort of stumbled into the whole field of pharmacokinetics. So I'd gone through a chemistry program. I love chemistry. And then I wanted to apply the chemistry to pharmaceutics and then ultimately into drug discovery and drug development. So then I went through that stream and wound up coming out with 2 different doctorates in the field and been doing drug development forever, it seems. But my first 10 years after I graduated with my PhD was spent as a faculty member. So I was working at a university in the University of Alberta in Canada, and I was there for 10 years. And you talk about big government, and you talk about big, politics and bureaucracy and all that. So I could tell like this is not a place I want to spend my career. So I went to talk to the dean actually, and I said, I think I'm going to leave. And he says, but you have a tenured faculty position, like you have tenure.
Yeah.
You have a research group. I had 11 people in my research group at the time. I had all my lectures all figured out and a research program. And
you were on the path of success.
I was on that path. Yeah, I was on the path. And I thought, I worked hard to accomplish what I did in academically, but it just wasn't quite doing what I wanted. My nature is that I wanted to get into drug discovery, but also into business because I've always been stimulated by the business environment. And I grew up in a business family. And for example, my younger brother, who also grew up obviously in the same business family, he got educated. He did his PhD in finance at Cornell. And then he went on to teach at Duke, and he's been in business his whole life. But he's academic business, and I'm actually real world business. So I just find it is like super exciting.
Yeah. I love business too. Been a small business individual, but I could remember back the time when I was a kid, getting involved in simple things that I now learned are indicators of entrepreneurship. Just some fun, cool experiences that, and just something about business that I just love, and it incorporates. Business is a huge part of our lives. What I love about the biotech industry is the layering, though, which you were just discussing, which is the high scientific acumen, the medical, and then layering, the business, and then with people, and so I'm in the recruiting side, and very much a people-oriented, emotional, intelligent type. I just get into that kind of stuff, and so there's all these layers to it. It just makes it exciting, I think. So
it's almost like you get the best of the world because you're really you're in a career that you're sitting at a buffet basically. And so you've got, like you said, you've got the science, you've got biology, you've got medicine, you've got pharmaceutics, pharmacology, in our case now AI, and then you've got the business aspect, which rolls in not just strategic thinking, like almost like playing at a big huge chessboard. You're thinking strategically, or you need to think strategically, but then you have to think in terms of like, what does the public market want to see, because we're NASDAQ traded. So then you have to start thinking about what are the SEC rules, what are the NASDAQ rules, what do the lawyers have to say, what do the auditors have to say, what are the accountants, so you've got this, like I say, a buffet of all these different things. So I'm probably a person that tends to get bored. And if I were to do just one thing, I might go out of my mind, and then maybe I would be a better golfer and look at something like that. But
you'd put your energy.
But
into
I'm
that.
so stimulated by just kind of the appetizers and the salads and the main course, and especially dessert, right? So you're pulling all that together and hoping that at the end of the road, you're not going to just have a successful business, but the benefit, of course, is that you're saving people's lives, or at least you're making hopefully a positive impact in people's lives, so that when eventually I am at the point at the end of my life, I can look back and say, maybe I wasn't the greatest father, maybe I wasn't the greatest whatever, but I was able to maybe put a dent in the lives of people who are suffering from diseases like NASH or liver cancer, or in my last venture, people with severe kidney illness, kidney disease that winds up that they can be on dialysis or actually in fact die. So, I think that's something. It's a little bit of a legacy, I guess.
Yeah, definitely it is. I I interviewed. I think his interview will come out in next week, I think. But I had the chance to interview an individual that actually was one of the scientists that developed a drug called Remicade for treating ulcerative colitis. And I grew up in a home where my father suffered and still does from ulcerative colitis.
Okay.
And so, looking back 35 years ago, or 30 years ago or whatever, and what that was like, living with my dad with treatments at the time that were the best that they had, but didn't actually, the side effects of medication are there, and you're willing to weigh that risk benefit, but at that time the treatments that were available just it was rough. It was rough for my dad.
Yeah.
And now, he's on to a new treatment called Humira. But he, for a while, he took Remicade, and he would go get those infusions.
Yeah.
And so, again, talking about legacy, right? It does make an impact. And I didn't even think about it. And then I start interviewing people, and all of a sudden I find myself interviewing somebody that developed a treatment that somebody I personally close to me know has been taking. And let alone the simple things that we take every day that are part of our life. So yeah, good stuff. Well, good. Well, I appreciate you donating the time to get on here and have this discussion with us while we're here. I'm in New Jersey visiting the Hepion corporate office. Real quick, I'm going to get a chance to interview another individual that I'm told actually won the naming contest for the company.
Yes, we had a little contest to come up with a name for this company, and the name ultimately became, of course, Hepion. And there's a little story behind that. It's pretty cool. But we had a naming contest, and we did it internally. I mean, a lot of people will go out externally and hire, a lot of consultants and people to look at all these different possibilities and wind up spending a lot of money. But it's just fun, if you sort of create this baby, you want to be able to, name your baby. And so she did a great job.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to having her on. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Robert.
Simon, okay?